Hello guys, hope you all are doing well. So in today's session, we will talk about how we can configure DHCP on Palo Alto Firewall. So starting with, let's look at little bit theory on DHCP. So what is DHCP? So DHCP is basically it assigns a dynamic IP address and it can reclaim it, right? So what are the ports used by DHCP? So as we know, like DHCP server, it uses UDP 68 and DHCP client, they use port 67. Additionally, we can use DHCP to deliver wide ranges of configuration parameters that can be pushed through DHCP. Right. So next, we'll take a look at DHCP message format. So this is basically a DHCP message format. We'll take a look at each and every field, what it is used for. Right. So functions of each field is like first is like OP field, which basically tells that the connection has been initiated by client or server. Secondly is H type field, which mentions hardware address in a client address field. Then there is a hardware length address field, which as name itself it says, and after that is a hops field, which shows how many hops the DHCP server is from the client. Then there is a transaction ID field, which shows us for which particular transaction the DHCP messages are there. Second message, it specifically tells us how much time is elapsed during the whole this DHCP process. Flags, basically it's used for the broadcast address. Then client address, it basically uses client computer IP address. Then YI address is basically the IP address offered to a client by server. SI address is used basically in case of diskless workstation, in which we mention the next server during the boot sequence. Then we have another field called GI address, which mentions the IP address of DHCP relay agent. Then we have CH address, client address, which is the address of the client system. S name basically says the host name of DHCP server. File, it basically is the path, where it gives a path where the executable files are stored, in case of like diskless workstation where that file can be used. And options field, as we know, there are a lot of configurations can be done using the options field. Right. So let me quickly check. So yeah, so as we can see that using this packet capture, these are all the fields that we talked about. So first field is boot request initiated by a client. Then hardware type is basically a Ethernet. Then hardware address length. Hop, basically it says 0, so it says that the DHCP server is local. Transaction IDs, as you can see that all the process DHCP discover, offer, request, and ACK. It does. They all have the same transaction ID. Seconds elapse, how much time it took. Then boot flag, as I mentioned, it's a broadcast. Then this is the client IP address. Your client IP address basically is this one. Then client MAC address is mentioned, hardware MAC address, server host name field, and this is the boot file name, not given as we have not mentioned anything. So these were the fields that we were talking about, right? So moving ahead, so that's done. So basically moving ahead, we'll talk about DHCP message types. So in Palo Alto, basically in options value, we have total 8 option value. As you can see, the DHCP message types for them is also mentioned here. That is DHCP discover, offer, request, decline, ACK, DHCP enact, DHCP release, and inform. Right. So we'll take a look one by one. What does this DHCP message type say? So discover, basically discover type, that is used by client to request configuration parameters from the DHCP server. Then second comes is offer type, that is used by server to offer IP address to DHCP client. Then there is a request message type. It's used by client to accept or renew an IP address assignment. Decline is used by client to decline an offered IP, as there might be cases where multiple DHCP server offering IP address to client. So in that case, client declines the IP. ACK message is basically used by server to act the client's acceptance of an IP address. ANAC is used by server to reject the client acceptance of an offered IP. So there may be a times where the client would be requesting a specific IP address. So in that case, when server looks at its own database and see that that IP address is already assigned, it sends a enact message. Release message is used by client to terminate the IP address lease. So when we type a command ipconfig slash release, usually you should see that message in packet capture. And then there is a inform used by client to obtain a additional TCP IP configuration from server. So these are basically message types of DHCP. Next we'll talk about how the DHCP communication works. So right. So basically it first starts with the client booting for the first time. It sends a broadcast message to server, which is a DHCP discover message type, and the state we say it is in a init state. This is sent by client to server. So next comes is unicast message from the server, which is a DHCP offer message, and it sends a optional parameters that those are configured on DHCP server. So this communications happen from server side towards client. Then next is DHCP request message, which is sent by client to the server. It is basically a broadcast type, and uh, DHCP request message. Then the fourth message is DHCP ACK, wherein the server agrees on, basically it acknowledges on the acceptance of IP address by the client. So this is the fourth message. And in the fifth message, basically client performs ARP again to make sure that the IP is not assigned to any other any other system, and then it enters into the state called bound state. Right. So this is basically a step that it goes through for DHCP communication between the client and server. Right. So next we will look at how to configure DHCP server on Palo Alto Firewall. So here in my lab, you need to go to Network, DHCP tab, then you need to click on Add and then select interface. In this case, I have selected ETH1/2 as a interface. Then you need to select mode as enabled, disabled, or auto. So basically auto mode, it says that if there is any other DHCP server detected in a network, it gets disabled itself. So in this case, auto mode is there. And then there is a field called lease. In this, we need to mention the lease time, for how much time the IP address would be retained by client. And next we need to mention is IP pool range, wherein you can mention the IP pool address that needs to be assigned to DHCP client. Reserve address is you can bind specific IP address to a MAC address. Then you need to come to options field, wherein you can mention all the DHCP custom options that you want to be pushed to client. Here on a basic setup, we have just mentioned the gateway, which is L3 IP on ETH1/2 interface, subnet mask, and just a primary DNS of Google. So that's the configuration being done for a DHCP server. This is basically our topology, wherein this is the firewall that is configured as a DHCP server on ETH1/2, and this is our test PC. So now let me bring up the test PC. So at the moment on this test PC, as you can see that the NIC is disabled. So I'm just now enabling the NIC, and let's see what the IP address it got. So when we go to details tab, we see that it got the IP address of 192.168.10.11. Now when we go to firewall and look at allocation, we can see that there's 192.168.10.11 with the MAC address and host name. State is committed, says that IP address has been configured, duration is this, lease time is this. So we can verify using this one. So this is how basically you can configure Palo Alto Firewall as a DHCP server. Right. So next, additionally, we can discuss about this packet capture for while DHCP communication happens. So if I look at discover message. So basically discover message, it is a broadcast, and you can see that the discover message is sent by client using UDP port 68 to port 67 on which the DHCP server listens, and make a note of the transaction ID here. Secondly, you can check that this message is sent by DHCP server as the source IP address is 10.1, where the source port is 67 and destination port is UDP 68. Here you can see that under options this is a DHCP message type 2, which is a offer. On options 54 you can see that what's the DHCP server IP, what's the lease time, it's actually 2 days 20 minutes, subnet mask, and the router IP. On the offer, another important field, you can see that this is the IP address that is being offered by client to server. So next is the DHCP request packet that is sent by client to server. So if you look at this, it is again a broadcast packet. Then when we come to DHCP message type, you can see it is a DHCP type 3 request. Then the requested IP address here is 10.11. Rest all fields remains the same, like DHCP server IP address and all those things remains the same. DHCP server IP address, host name, you can see option 11. What's the host name? It's mentioned here. So that's the request packet. Next is ACK packet that is sent by server to the client, in which you can see that under uh, your client IP address, it mentions the client IP address, and rest all fields we already discussed, it remains the same. Just the change is here we can see that the DHCP message type is ACK here. So address lease time we already checked, server identifier remains the same, and all those things. So DNS server, as you saw, we gave it 8.8.8. That's what domain name server. We see it here. So this is all about how we can configure DHCP server on Palo Alto Firewall. If you have any questions, please do comment. I'll try to answer. Thanks for your time. You have a good day. Bye.